Have you ever wondered why certain words or gestures from a child hurt more than any blow life can throw at you? I'm not talking about normal mistakes or the disagreements that come with growing up and becoming your own person. I'm talking about those actions that cut deep, that time doesn't erase, and that leave a quiet but lasting mark on a parent's heart. Because there are wounds that don't bleed on the outside, yet they shape the way you look at yourself again. Many people who come to this channel carry a guilt that isn't theirs, a fatigue they can't quite explain, and a question that repeats silently. How much am I supposed to endure for love? They were taught that being a good father or mother means sacrificing without limits, forgiving everything, and always staying quiet. But no one told them that real love should not require giving up one's dignity, or that certain behaviors from adult children, if left unspoken, end up poisoning the bond and the soul as well. I'm Gabriel. I've spent many years studying and practicing Stoicism applied to everyday life. I'm a father, and I've learned to reflect on relationships, boundaries, and emotional dignity in adulthood. On this channel, I share that path, not from a place of superiority, but from lived experience. If this topic resonates with you, I invite you to stay until the end of this video, and if you feel it, to subscribe. What we're going to explore today may help you regain clarity, calm, and self-respect without stopping loving. Why can a child come to treat with indifference those who were there when he couldn't fend for himself? This is one of the most painful questions a father or mother can ask, because it doesn't point only to the present, but stirs up the entire shared history. In this first point, when we talk about the silent contempt that leaves a lasting mark, it's not enough to describe the behavior. It's necessary to understand what may be happening inside that child for him to choose silence, distance, or indifference as a way of relating. One of the most common psychological roots has to do with unresolved emotional wounds. There are children who grew up feeling unseen, unheard, or excessively pressured, even when their parents did the best they could. I'm not necessarily talking about obvious mistreatment, but about subjective experiences. A child may have felt that he had to meet very high expectations to deserve affection, or that there was no space for his emotional world. Years later, that child, now an adult, doesn't complain, doesn't confront, doesn't explain. He simply pulls away. Silent contempt in many cases is a defense against an old pain he never knew how to put into words. Another deep root is often unconscious guilt. It may sound paradoxical, but some children distance themselves precisely because they know, on some level, that they have hurt or are hurting their parents. Instead of facing that inner discomfort, they choose the easiest path for the human mind: avoidance. Avoiding contact, avoiding deep conversations, avoiding the other's gaze that might reflect back an uncomfortable image of themselves. In this case, silence is not pure contempt, but an awkward way of fleeing from guilt and emotional responsibility. Psychology also observes that some children develop an identity based on extreme self-sufficiency. People who learned very early that emotional dependence was dangerous or pointless. Perhaps they experienced loss, abandonment, instability, or emotionally overwhelmed adults. To survive, they learned not to need. Over time, that strategy becomes character. As adults, they interpret closeness as intrusion and any expectation of contact as a burden. They don't ignore out of cruelty. They ignore because their nervous system associates connection with threat, not refuge. From a Stoic perspective, Seneca warned that many times people hurt others not out of malice, but out of ignorance of themselves. This does not justify the harm, but it helps to understand it. Understanding is not the same as absolving. It is stopping the habit of personalizing every gesture as if it were a final judgment on your worth as a father or mother. A A child who acts with indifference is often trapped in his own inner conflict, even if from the outside he appears cold, distant, or even arrogant. There is also a more contemporary cultural root. We live in a time that glorifies a misunderstood version of independence, where cutting off, blocking, and disappearing are presented as signs of emotional health. Some children have learned that pulling away without explanation is a legitimate form of self-care. No one taught them to distinguish between setting boundaries and emotionally abandoning someone, so they repeat a model that rewards disconnection and punishes the discomfort of adult dialogue. At this point, there is something essential I want you to notice. Understanding the psychological roots of this attitude does not mean denying the pain it causes. You can understand the origin of the other person's wound and still acknowledge that their behavior hurts you. Viktor Frankl said that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. Your freedom here is not in changing your child, but in not allowing his silence to erase you as a person. This first point is not meant to make you justify yourself or carry guilt that doesn't belong to you. It is meant to help you stop asking what you did so wrong to deserve this treatment and start asking what you need so you don't keep living from the wound. A child's silent contempt may have many roots, but none of them invalidate your right to be treated with respect. And when that is truly understood, something inside begins to settle, even if the other person has not yet changed. There is a quiet moment when love begins to blur into obligation. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens when a child stops asking and starts demanding, when gratitude disappears because everything is assumed to be guaranteed. In this second point, when I speak about children who cross boundaries and act as if everything is owed to them, I want you to look not only at the external behavior, but at the inner dynamic that slowly forms between parents and adult children when no one names it in time. Many older parents live this wound with a mix of exhaustion and shame. Exhaustion because they are always available, always fixing, supporting, giving in. Shame because they feel that setting a boundary would make them bad parents. This is where psychology offers an important first key. Some children grew up in environments where love was expressed mainly through constant giving, without clear limits. Not because the parents did something wrong, but because they believed that loving meant giving without measure. That message, repeated over many years, may have taught the child that receiving is a right, not a shared responsibility. Another common psychological root is prolonged emotional immaturity. Some children never fully made the inner transition into psychological adulthood. They may be adults in age, work, or appearance, but they still function emotionally like children who expect to be carried. This often happens when, early on, they were not allowed to feel frustration, make mistakes, or face consequences. The result is not malice, but a real difficulty in recognizing the other as a separate being, with limits, fatigue, and needs of their own. There is also a less visible but very powerful wound, unexpressed resentment. Some children, consciously or not, hold old grievances toward their parents. Perhaps over decisions they didn't understand, absences that hurt, real or imagined mistakes. Instead of talking about it, of working through it, they turn it into an inverted debt. Now it's my turn to receive, something inside them seems to say. From there, emotional abuse disguises itself as a silent claim, and demands are experienced as compensation. The problem is that this crossing of boundaries often settles in with the unintentional complicity of parental love. The father or mother keeps giving to avoid conflict, to avoid losing the bond, to avoid feeling guilty. And so, an unbalanced circuit forms, where one becomes exhausted and the other doesn't even notice. Neuroscience shows us that the brain adapts quickly to constant benefits. What has no limits stops being valued, not out of cruelty, but out of habituation. Seneca warned that those who don't know how to say enough eventually lose themselves, and this is crucial here. Helping an adult child is not the same as supporting them indefinitely. Loving is not becoming an endless resource. When a child acts as if everything is owed to them, it doesn't only harm the father or mother, it also harms the child because it deprives them of the chance to grow, take responsibility, and see the other with humanity. With that in mind, it's important to pause on an idea that releases a great deal of guilt. Setting boundaries does not break a healthy bond, it brings order to it. Systemic psychology shows that family systems without clear limits tend to generate resentment, dependency, and deep exhaustion. A boundary is not punishment, it is information. It tells the other where your responsibility ends and where theirs begins. This second point is essential because it touches a wound that is often justified for far too long. If you keep giving out of fear instead of conscious choice, love empties out and turns into obligation. Recognizing that a child has crossed boundaries does not make you a selfish father or mother. It makes you a lucid adult who begins to reclaim their place. And from that place, paradoxically, the bond has a better chance of becoming real rather than a silent burden dragged on for years. There is a way of hurting that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't insult, and yet leaves a father or mother completely defenseless on the inside. It's emotional blackmail. In this third point, I want you to calmly observe how love can be used as a bargaining chip, how certain phrases, silences, or attitudes from a child are not aimed at dialogue, but at control. Because when a bond is sustained through guilt, it stops being love and becomes an invisible prison. Emotional blackmail often has deep roots in the child's history. It frequently appears in people who never learn to regulate their emotions in a healthy way. As children, they may have only received attention through drama, illness, anger, or victimhood. The internal message was clear, even if never spoken out loud. If I suffer, they notice me. If I blame, they listen to me. Years later, that childhood strategy is still active, now directed at aging parents. They don't always do it with full awareness, but the damage is real. Another common psychological root is an intense fear of abandonment. Some children live with an inner terror of being left alone, of not being supported, of not being prioritized. Instead of expressing that fear with vulnerability, they translate it into reproach. If you don't do this for me, you're failing me. After everything I've been through, I can't believe you would deny me this. The hidden message is not anger, it's panic. But the effect on the father or mother is devastating because it places them in a constant state of emotional debt. Psychology shows that emotional blackmail rests on three very clear pillars: fear, guilt, and obligation. The child activates one of them or all three to get what they want. And the father or mother, out of love, exhaustion, or personal history, gives in. Every time they give in, the mechanism is reinforced, not because the child is evil, but because the brain learns that this strategy works. What works gets repeated. This is where many parents lose themselves. They begin to live with the constant feeling that they are never doing enough, that they are always falling short. They ask themselves what they did wrong, what they should make up for, how to avoid the next reproach. Stoicism is very clear on this point. Epictetus said that no one can enslave you without your inner consent. And emotional blackmail, painful as it is to say, only survives when fear and guilt rule decisions. I want to pause briefly here. If this content is resonating with you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your name and the country you're listening from. I always read the comments, and this space exists so no one has to reflect on these things alone. Knowing you're there on the other side also gives meaning to this work. That said, let's return to the topic. Recognizing emotional blackmail does not mean stopping loving. It means stopping the negotiation of your dignity. Adult love is not proven through constant sacrifice. It's proven through honesty and respect. Viktor Frankl reminded us that true love desires the other person's growth, not their dependence. When you always give in out of guilt, you don't help growth, you reinforce fragility. This third point is an important turning point because it shows that pain doesn't always come from rejection. Sometimes it comes from excessive closeness that is poorly managed. When a child turns love into debt, the bond becomes suffocating. Seeing it clearly is the first step towards stepping out of that silent game. Not to punish, not to break away, but to stop living emotionally on your knees. And from there, paradoxically, love can breathe again. There are wounds that are not caused by absence, but by exposure. Moments when a child, consciously or not, ridicules, discredits, or undermines a father or mother in front of others, or even in private with a phrase, a mockery, or a gesture that leaves the other person speechless. In this fourth point, I want you to face an uncomfortable truth head-on. Humiliation, when it comes from a child, touches a very deep layer of identity and is not easily erased. From a psychological perspective, one of the most common roots of this behavior is role reversal. Some children grew up feeling emotionally above their parents. Perhaps they had to mature too quickly to give opinions, make decisions, or emotionally support adults who couldn't do it themselves. That child learns, without realizing it, that they hold moral authority over their father or mother. Years later, that poorly digested authority shows up as disdain, constant correction, or ridicule. They don't humiliate because they hate. They humiliate because they never stopped feeling in a superior position. Another possible route is projected shame. Some children carry unresolved inner conflicts about their own lives, decisions, or failures. Instead of facing them, they project that discomfort outward. The father or mother becomes an easy target because they represent authority, origin, and history. By humiliating them, the child momentarily relieves their own sense of inadequacy. It's a well-studied defensive mechanism, lowering the other to avoid facing one's own pain. There is also something that needs to be said, even though it often hurts to hear it. We live in a culture that has lost respect for older adults. Many children have absorbed a social message in which experience has no value, the old are seen as a burden, and correcting, exposing, or ridiculing a parent is framed as a sign of moral superiority or intelligence. When this narrative takes hold, humiliation becomes normalized. It disguises itself as humor, brutal honesty, or modern thinking, but it remains a lack of respect. From a Stoic perspective, Musonius Rufus held that dignity is not negotiated, it is embodied. The problem is that many parents, out of fear of losing the bond, tolerate humiliation in silence. They laugh to avoid discomfort, stay quiet to avoid conflict, minimize themselves to avoid seeming sensitive. And in doing so, without realizing it, they reinforce a dynamic in which the child learns that this boundary can be crossed without visible emotional consequences. Social neuroscience shows that humiliation activates areas of the brain associated with deep shame and collapse of the self. It is not an exaggeration to say it leaves lasting marks. That's why when someone says, "It wasn't that bad," they are often speaking from denial, not understanding. For a father or mother, being humiliated by a child doesn't just hurt, it disrupts the inner place from which one looks at oneself. Now, understanding the roots does not mean tolerating the harm. You can understand that your child is acting from their own wound and still decide that you are not willing to be treated that way. Marcus Aurelius reminded us that no one can degrade you without your inner cooperation. That doesn't mean fighting. It means not laughing at what hurts you, not normalizing what diminishes you, not justifying the unjustifiable. This fourth point is crucial because it draws a clear line between love and self-erasure. Humiliation does not teach, does not bring closeness, does not heal. It only leaves scars. Recognizing it, naming it, and stopping its tolerance does not break a healthy bond, it purifies it. And if the bond cannot be sustained without humiliating you, then the question that remains is not how much more you can endure, but how much of yourself you are willing to lose to avoid making the other uncomfortable. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being left behind without explanation. In this fifth point, I want us to look at a very common wound in later life. When a child justifies their complete absence in the name of independence, personal growth, or having their own life, and the father or mother is left trying to understand when they went from being a source of support to becoming a silent burden. Independence is necessary and healthy. The problem arises when it is used as an excuse to cut the emotional bond without taking responsibility for the impact. From a psychological perspective, one of the most common roots of this behavior is avoidant attachment. Some people learned very early on that emotional dependence was not safe. Perhaps they grew up with emotionally cold, unpredictable, or overwhelmed adults. To survive, they developed a clear inner strategy: I don't need anyone. Years later, that defense is activated, even with those who pose no real threat, such as their own parents. The abandonment is not conscious contempt, it is an automatic flight from closeness. Another important root is the confusion between individuation and rupture. Many children were never taught that it's possible to be autonomous without emotionally disappearing. No one showed them how to set boundaries without cutting off, how to differentiate without dehumanizing the other. In their minds, growing up means pulling away completely, not responding, not getting involved, not being present. The problem is that this version of independence leaves deep collateral damage, especially for older parents who are not seeking control, but minimal emotional presence. There are also children who carry old resentment that was never worked through. Perhaps they felt their parents were not there in the ways they needed, that other things were prioritized, that they were not truly seen. Instead of talking about it, of confronting it from adulthood, they choose a silent revenge. They disappear. They don't explain. They don't bring closure. Emotional abandonment becomes passive punishment. From the outside, it looks like coldness, but inside, there is often frozen pain. Today's culture reinforces this pattern. The idea is promoted that cutting ties is a sign of self-love, that owing nothing to anyone equals strength. But the human cost of that narrative is rarely discussed. Viktor Frankl warned that human beings find fulfillment in relationship, not in isolation. When independence turns into total disconnection, something essential is lost, both in the one who leaves and in the one who is left behind. For the father or mother, this wound is often lived with deep guilt. They ask themselves what they did wrong, where they failed, why they are no longer sought out. Psychology is clear here. An adult child's emotional abandonment does not always speak to the parent's worth, but to the way the child learned to relate to closeness. Personalizing everything only deepens the wound. From a Stoic perspective, Marcus Aurelius reminded us that we cannot demand that others act according to our expectations, but we can decide how we take care of ourselves in the face of their choices. The mistake is not in missing someone, the mistake is in interpreting yourself as disposable. You can acknowledge that your child chose a distance that hurts you without turning that choice into a final judgment on your value. This fifth point is especially delicate because there is no open conflict, no words to argue over. There is only silence and absence, but even there, an inner boundary can begin to take shape. not to force the other to return, but to stop waiting from the wound. Understanding that misunderstood independence does not justify emotional abandonment allows something essential: beginning to build a life where your peace does not depend on the presence of someone who chose not to be there. And from there, curiously, the bond, if it ever returns, can do so from a healthier place, not from lack. There is a wound that is especially hard to name because it is not lived only in the present, but contaminates the entire past. It happens when an adult child begins to rewrite the family story and places the father or mother in the role of the one to blame for everything. In this sixth point, I want you to look calmly at this dynamic because it hurts not only for what is being said now, but because it dismantles the meaning of an entire life given over with mistakes, yes, but also with effort, presence, and love. From a psychological perspective, one of the most common roots of this behavior is the need to give coherence to one's own pain. When an adult goes through frustration, failure, or deep dissatisfaction, the mind looks for causes. And very often, the most accessible explanation is the origin. Blaming parents allows inner chaos to be organized into a clear narrative. If I feel like this today, it's because they did this. It is not always a conscious lie, but it is often a defensive simplification. The complexity of life is reduced to a story where someone has to carry the blame. Another important root is the difficulty of tolerating ambivalence. Maturing means accepting that those who raised us could love us and make mistakes at the same time. Some children cannot hold that inattention. They need the parent to be good or bad, a savior or a villain. When they choose the second option, they feel temporary relief because they no longer have to deal with gratitude and anger at the same time. The problem is that in doing so, they erase everything that doesn't fit that narrative, including genuine moments of care and presence. There is also the influence of certain contemporary discourses that are poorly digested. Some psychological and cultural currents, taken out of context, invite people to revisit childhood in search of culprits rather than understanding. Some children take these ideas as absolute truths and apply them without nuance. Every limit was abuse, every absence was abandonment, every mistake was trauma. The father or mother becomes a symbolic figure onto whom discomfort is unloaded, even when that discomfort does not have a single cause. For the person on the receiving end, this wound is devastating. They don't just feel accused, they feel erased, as if everything good never existed or had no value at all. Many older parents live this with a mix of disbelief and late-arriving guilt. They ask themselves whether they really were that bad, whether they deceived themselves their whole lives, whether they deserve that final judgment. This is where Stoicism offers essential clarity. Marcus Aurelius reminded us that we should not accept someone else's opinion as automatic truth, even when it comes from someone we love deeply. Relational psychology is clear about something that brings great relief when it is understood. Memory is not an objective archive. It is a reconstruction influenced by the current emotional state. A child who is angry, frustrated, or lost today remembers the past from that place. That does not invalidate their pain, but it does not turn their version into the whole truth either. Understanding this makes it possible to stop defending yourself compulsively and at the same time to stop endlessly accusing yourself. This sixth point is crucial because it touches identity. When a child turns you into the villain, the risk is that you begin to see yourself only through their eyes. Viktor Frankl said that no one can take away the meaning of your life unless you hand it over. Your story is broader than a narrative narrowed by another person's resentment. Acknowledging mistakes does not mean accepting an absolute condemnation. Closing this point does not mean denying the child's pain or breaking the bond. It means something more subtle and stronger. It means holding your inner truth calmly without needing to convince or submit. You can listen without erasing yourself. You can reflect without destroying yourself. When you stop arguing with the story and start inhabiting your dignity, something shifts. The other person may not see it right away, but you no longer live under permanent accusation. And that, in maturity, is a profound form of freedom. There comes a point when pain stops being ambiguous and becomes direct. It is no longer silence, irony, or disguised absence. It is outright rejection. A child who says, "I don't want to see you, don't write to me anymore. If you don't do this, don't count on me," or who threatens to cut off the relationship if the father or mother does not submit to certain conditions. In this seventh point, we enter the rawest wound because it confronts a person with a question no one wants to ask. How much of myself am I willing to lose in order not to lose my child? From a psychological perspective, one of the most common roots of this open rejection is the confusion between boundaries and power. Some children learned that setting limits means dominating, imposing, winning. Instead of saying "this I can't do" or "this hurts me," they say "this is how it is" or "there is no relationship." They are not seeking dialogue, they are seeking control. This way of relating often originates in histories where conflict was never worked through, but resolved through ultimatums, emotional withdrawal, or effective punishment. The child repeats what they learned, even though the position of power has now been reversed. Another deep root is identity fragility. Some children cannot tolerate a father or mother who stands firm, thinks differently, or does not validate all of their decisions. The mere existence of a voice that does not submit is experienced as a threat. So rejection appears as a defense mechanism. I cut off before I feel questioned. Rejection does not always come from hatred. Many times it comes from the inability to live with difference without feeling attacked. There is also something uncomfortable but necessary to say. In some cases, rejection is a way of discharging life frustration. The child is not at peace with themselves, with their life, or with their choices. But looking inward hurts too much. It is easier to point outward. The father or mother becomes an emotional scapegoat. By rejecting them, the child feels a momentary illusion of relief, as if expelling the other also expelled their own discomfort. The problem is that this relief does not last, and the bond is left devastated. For the father or mother, this point is often lived with terror, fear of being left alone, of not seeing grandchildren, of dying without that bond. And from that fear, many accept conditions they would never accept from anyone else. They silence truths, endure disrespect, betray themselves. Stoicism is very clear here. Epictetus taught that there are things worse than losing relationships, and one of them is losing respect for yourself. Love that demands humiliation is not love. It is emotional dependence. This does not mean responding to rejection with more rejection. It is not about punishing or slamming doors impulsively. It is about something more difficult and more noble. It is about not negotiating dignity, about saying, even if only inwardly, that there are conditions I am not willing to accept, even if it hurts. Viktor Frankl reminded us that human beings can endure almost any pain if they preserve a sense of self. What destroys us is not loss. It is self-erasure. This final point closes the entire journey because it leaves the listener face to face with their own center. There are no magic formulas here. There is an intimate choice to love without crawling, to wait without disappearing, to remain open without surrendering to abuse. Open rejection from a child can break the soul, but it can also be the place where, for the first time, you choose yourself without stopping loving. And when that happens, something deep falls back into order. The bond may change, or it may not. But you no longer live from fear. You live from dignity. Perhaps after hearing all this, an unusual feeling remains, a mix of relief and sadness. relief for finally putting words to pains that had been operating in silence for years. Sadness because no one should reach this stage of life feeling invisible, guilty, or disposable to those they love most. But there is something important I want to emphasize. The fact that these wounds exist does not mean your life is defined by them. It means the time has come to look at them honestly and stop carrying what does not belong to you, too. Throughout this journey, we saw something very clear. The conflict is not in loving an adult child. The conflict appears when that love is sustained at the cost of dignity, when one gets used to staying quiet, justifying, enduring, not by conscious choice, but out of fear. Stoicism reminds us that serenity does not come from controlling others, but from putting our inner world in order. And that order begins when you decide to stop negotiating your personal worth, even if the other person is not ready to understand it. I want to tell you something with great clarity and deep respect. You are not weak for continuing to love, but you are not cruel for setting limits either. You are not selfish for taking care of yourself, nor have you failed as a father or mother for acknowledging that something hurts. Maturity does not consist of enduring everything, but of knowing what you are and are not willing to keep carrying. And that decision, even if no one else sees it, has a profound impact on your inner peace. Thank you for giving me your time and your attention. This channel exists to accompany silent processes, to offer words where there was once only confusion, and to remind you that even in the later stage of life, it is possible to live with more calm, more clarity, and more self-respect. If this video left you thinking, I invite you to comment with this phrase: "Today, I begin to take care of myself without stopping loving." Reading your words is a way of continuing to walk this path together. I send you a big hug. We'll meet again in the next video to keep reflecting, without noise, without guilt, and without giving up what matters most: your inner peace.